Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event by Goldfields Libraries. My name is Tammy and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator for Goldfields Libraries. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Dja Dja Wurrung country here in Maiden Gully, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tonight's event is a talk by Associate Professor Katharine McKinnon, who is the Director of the Centre for Sustainable Communities at the University of Canberra. Katharine is a human geographer whose work engages with community economies, gender, development and care. She works with a broad range of communities in Australia and the Asia Pacific, engaging in qualitative and participatory social research for community learning and development. Tonight, Katharine will be talking about her book, Birthing Work, which explores the spaces and experiences of childbirth. Her book draws on ethnographic interviews with mothers, midwives and obstetricians and suggests that childbirth is a collective endeavour. Each of the book's 8 chapters focuses on different human and non-human actors in the birth space that bring us into new relationships. I'd like to welcome you, Katharine, on behalf of Goldfields Libraries, and thank you very much for coming to share your insights and research with us tonight.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here, and great to have the opportunity to do this even in this time of lockdown. So this was meant to be a book launch that was going to be in person at the lovely local Castlemaine Library here in Victoria. And I was looking forward to having an event where friends and family could all be there. And unfortunately, we had to delay due to COVID. But fortunately, now we're able to do it online, and that means also that people from other parts of Australia and the world can join us. I'd like to add my acknowledgement of country. You'll see where I'm sitting is my little studio where I wrote a lot of the book, and it is also situated on Dja Dja Wurrung country. And I had the lovely experience of being able to look out the windows and see the bush change through the seasons as I was working on this. So there's a little piece of the spirit of country in the book as well. So today I just wanted to give you a little story about how this book came into being, what the intention was behind writing it. And then I've got a short video to show, because my plan this year had been to be traveling around giving talks about the book and sharing it with people around Australia and elsewhere. That had to be cancelled, and the travel budget that I had from La Trobe University, where I was working at the time, I reassigned to taking a video of myself talking about the book with some great animations done by some wonderful local helpers here where I am in Castlemaine. So I wanted to share that with you as well. And then hopefully have a bit of time for questions or discussion. There's a chat screen, I believe, beside where you're viewing. So if you think of any questions or you have ideas that come up as you're listening, please feel free to type away. And Stuart, who's in the background helping with the technical stuff, will make sure that I can see them as well. At the moment, I'm sitting in my studio and I can just see a blank screen and a little green light on my laptop screen. So it would be really lovely to have some chats come through so I know how it's all being received. So this book is Birthing Work. It's a very little book, but it took a really long time. I started working on this project the year that I returned to work after the birth of my second child, and she is now 10 years old. So it has been a project of what they call slow scholarship. It came into being for a few reasons. One was that as I was going through pregnancy and becoming a mother for the first time, I had a hard time finding things to read that fit what I was really after. You had the sort of what to expect when you're expecting kind of books which gave a whole lot of clinical advice and assumed that you would have an obstetrician that you were going to see. And then at the other end of the spectrum, I had the wonderful material by people like Sheila Kitzinger, who's a beautiful writer and an anthropologist that talks a lot about the natural processes of childbirth. But I had a hard time relating to that as well. She talked a lot about how the body just knows instinctively what to do. And I didn't feel like I knew instinctively what to do. So between the very kind of cold clinical books and then the more kind of books celebrating the naturalness of birth, I didn't have something that I really related to. As an academic, as someone who's interested in ideas, I wanted a way to explore the experience of childbirth that also gave me food for thought in thinking about what that meant. Because birth is both an extremely profound experience and it's really hard work. So I wanted something that would speak to both aspects of the experience. The other thing that happened at that moment was that I moved to Australia. I'm a New Zealander originally, and I had my first baby in New Zealand with a midwife as the lead maternity carer, which is I think the majority of women in New Zealand have midwives as their main carers. The midwife that I had in that first pregnancy was the same person I saw all through it. She was there for the birth and she was there for the weeks of postnatal care as well. And I really liked that. I liked the fact that I knew this woman and I got to trust her. And so when it came to the really confronting experience of childbirth, it's an intense experience. I was in the room with somebody that I really trusted, and that was really important. When I came to Australia, we moved to Sydney to take up work at Macquarie University there. And suddenly, if I wanted to have the same person be my carer throughout the pregnancy and the birth, I had a really stark choice I had to make. I was living on the North Shore and I could either hire a private obstetrician and have access to the hospital system that way, and it would be the same person that I saw throughout the pregnancy, or I could take the more radical decision of hiring an independent midwife who was not well integrated with the hospital system at that time. And luckily, the midwife that I did see during my pregnancy was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And she helped me to navigate the system, helped me to understand what was going on and to find my way through all the choices that had to be made. But what was going on in that context was that I was confronting a real polarization here between a medical system and a medicalized sort of model of birth, and that of a midwifery-led, women-centered natural birth. Rosemary McCall has called this the birth wars, and she engaged in an evaluation of maternity care in Australia that really pointed out that there's a conflict between these two models, the medical model and the advocates for natural birth, and that women in Australia are losing out because of that clash. When I tried to read my way through it and to understand what was going on, to kind of puzzle out why this was happening, it was very hard to find material that wasn't on one side or the other. And I felt like every time I was confronted with a choice through my care, I also was having to choose between one side or the other. So I really wanted to explore that and to try and find a way to not have to choose a side. It seemed puzzling and unnecessary. So that's in part what prompted this work. I wanted to try and find a way to explore the experience of childbirth without necessarily having to land in one camp or the other of these debates. And one thing that really helped me in that was that I was reading this wonderful and dense book by Jane Bennett, who talks about vibrant matter and the political ecology of things. Bennett's main point is that objects and things have agency. She explores, in fact, a whole history of philosophical thinking that looks into the ways in which the stuff that we live with and we live around has a life. It's not just that that it's there and we create it and we make it, but that it also is shaping us and acting upon us. I think that idea can feel really odd to some people, but you know, if you think about, if you're someone that works with wood, you know that you have to work with the wood, that the wood is also in a way making decisions about what you can or cannot do with it. If you're an artist working with clay, you know that the clay has an agency. You can ask it to do things, you can try to negotiate with it, but in some ways it determines the shape that you make. Even writing, you'd think that dealing with language comes from us and we control it and we're in charge of it, but any writer knows that the words take their own direction, that characters and stories go their own way that you didn't intend, that a poem works out its own way. It has agency, it makes its own decisions. And at that time, here I was heavily pregnant, and this will be familiar to anyone that's experienced it. You suddenly have this huge belly that in a way has a life of its own, and you have to negotiate your being in the world in a very different way. You don't know, you're going down a corridor, someone's coming towards you, you don't know if you should face them or if you should turn, which way are you, wider or narrower. You have to negotiate the spaces that you're in a really different way. And at the same time, you're constantly interacting with objects in different ways. You know, the regular having to pee on a stick that's going to tell you the pH of your urine, as one example. You have to encounter the stuff in your world in a really different way when you're pregnant. So this idea of stuff having agency was really interesting to me, and it helped to shape the project that I then did when I came back from my maternity leave. So that project was really small. It was a small grant from Macquarie University that gave me time and a little bit of money to go and interview people about childbirth. So I recruited a wonderful colleague, Kelly Dombrowski, who's now in New Zealand, to help me do these interviews. And we went and spoke to women, and we spoke to midwives, and we spoke to obstetricians about the stuff in the room of birth. So it was about the spaces that people give birth in and how people interact with the stuff. What is in that space? How does that stuff have agency? How does that stuff influence the way that a birth unfolds? How does it influence the experiences that women have? And what came out of that was this realization that all of these things come together and interact in a really productive way. And I started to think about the way all these things do work in the birth space. So the video that we want to show gives a sense of that sort of key idea that runs through the book. And I need to point out as well that although that was a really, for me, it was a really interesting thing to find from all the interviews, it's only a partial picture of the birth experience. So in the book, there are lots of stories that I share from those interviews, stories that where people are talking about, well, what was that, you know, the CTG machine in the corner of the room, what was it doing? How did it shape what was going on? Or how did the clock on the wall shape the experience? But also how the people in the room made different things happen or opened up different kinds of possibilities. But it's not a representative sample of all women in Australia and New Zealand. It was a small project, and we were really just talking to whoever was willing to offer up their story. So it was quite a happenstance kind of collection of stories that came in. So in the book, I tell some of the stories from those interviews, and I talk about the really key things in the birth space that influence the experience. And I also share some of my own stories because although it is an academic book, I wanted it to be an accessible book as much as possible. And I wanted it to be a book that was open-hearted, that invited people into that really profound experience of childbirth. So I hope the video gets some of these ideas across, and I'd really love to hear reactions as we go. So I'll hand it over now, Stuart, if you can start the video, and I'll see you all again after it. Childbirth is brief, but the experience affects us deeply and in long-lasting ways. In the media, we often see stories of life-saving heroics or the tragic misjudgments of isolated individuals. But my research tells a very different story. My book, Birthing Work, is about a research project that was conducted with the help of my colleague, Kelly Dombrowski. We interviewed mothers, midwives, and obstetricians in Australia and New Zealand. We asked them about their experiences of birth and what happens in the birth space. What came through most clearly is that no one thing shapes that experience. There isn't one right way to have a baby, and no single person in that space is solely in charge of what happens. The experience of childbirth is determined by everyone and everything that gathers around a woman in labour. It's a collective effort. Childbirth is brief, but there is a lot to learn from this one moment. From the beginning, the experience of pregnancy has the potential to teach us how interdependence is central to life. My own wake-up call came early in my first pregnancy. I was honeymooning on the back of a motorcycle. I was 3 weeks pregnant and completely unprepared. At the beginning, it was really the shock of losing control that got to me. My body was no longer my own. And this was a surprise after spending much of my adult life feeling like I was in charge, pushing my body to do what I wanted it to do. Now, suddenly, and quite unexpectedly, my body commanded me to stop, to rest, to eat, to sleep right now. And if I didn't, I'd soon be falling off the back of the bike. It was pretty clear that I was no longer in charge. My well-being suddenly depended on the needs and rhythms of my unborn child, who was at that time just a minuscule collection of cells. At the same time, I had to suddenly make a series of changes to how I lived my life. My body demanded frequent food and rest, and the leaflets I was given by my midwife informed me that I should be very careful about what I ate. Soft cheeses, pre-prepared deli foods, runny egg yolk, salami were all off the menu. And suddenly I found myself eating salt and vinegar chips in bed at 5 a.m. to keep away morning sickness. I couldn't stand to drink coffee anymore, and wine was forbidden. I didn't feel particularly in control of myself or my body, but I did carry all the responsibility. The leaflets made me feel like if I did the wrong thing, my child would be harmed, and it would be all my fault. Many of the women we spoke to felt the same way. Most maternity care systems focus on the choices made by the mother. She's very often regarded as a rational individual who ought to be able to make the right decisions about her pregnancy. From the very earliest stages of pregnancy, experience teaches us something different. Becoming a mother involves entering into a co-production of a shared existence, a co-becoming. It begins in the body, as a fetus and a mother begin to collaborate on growing a new life. This is the work of cells and biochemistry, of blood and muscle and bone. The experience of pregnancy is also shaped by the families that we are in, by the belief systems we hold, the cultures we are from. And different bodies get treated differently. It shouldn't be the case, but skin colour and ethnicity have an impact on what kind of care a woman receives. By the time a woman is in a room delivering her baby, she is at the centre of a whole gathering. There's everything that's going on in her body and her baby's body, But there are also the other people in the room: family members, midwives, obstetricians, medical students, anaesthetists. Each of those people brings in different stuff, different knowledge, different expectations, and different biases. And looming over the shoulders of all the medical staff are things like hospital policies, insurance policies, drug companies, managers, actuaries. It goes on. Emotions and sensations also loom large. Lots of people are nervous. Lots of people are excited. Sometimes people are fearful and anxious. The woman is almost always in pain. Sometimes it's good pain, other times it's not. Then there's the furniture, the bright lights, the equipment. There's a bed that calls you to lie down on it, even though all the research tells us childbirth will go more smoothly if a woman is up and moving around. Somewhere there's a clock ticking, and somewhere someone might be pouring a bath. The whole is a messy and complicated picture, and nothing in it is entirely neutral. My claim is that all these things, the people, the bodies, the bed, are all contributing actively to the experience of childbirth. They're not just neutral observers of the birth process. They are active agents. They do work. And in fact, they do work together. All the human and non-human actors present in childbirth are our inevitable companions, and together they have a collective effect on what unfolds. The question is, how do we harness that collective to make sure each and every child has a good beginning in life? How do we harness that collective so that each woman has a good start to motherhood? The answers are not the same for everybody. And this is especially true for women from different cultural class backgrounds, women in different parts of the world, LGBTQ women, women with different religious or spiritual beliefs, women who are rich and women who are poor. There's no one right way to have a baby, but our maternity care systems often function as if there is. What gets forgotten is that there is a whole range of actors shaping birth. What we can think about is how to bring these actors together into a team. How do we get that collective to work together to support a positive, even an empowering experience of birth? In the book, I highlight 8 of the things that are almost always present in childbirth. And the stories I share show how these 8 companions have the potential to shape beautiful birth experiences. First, there is the collective as a whole. I talk about this as an assemblage. The assembled parts are never exactly the same. What each actor does or how it interacts with another can be managed but never controlled. And within the assemblage is the mother and her baby. One thing that was clear from our interviews was that women were forming relationships with their babies from the very beginning of pregnancy. And the baby is also doing her own thing, turning this way, putting a foot here and an elbow there, perhaps pushing herself out, perhaps refusing to move. A live baby is not just an outcome of birth, but an active participant. There are bodies at work in childbirth, and not all bodies are the same. A body might do the work of labour well, or it might go on strike. A body might give birth beautifully, no matter the environment, or it might be a body that needs careful coaxing and gentle touch. It might be a fearful body, or a body that feels safe. Then there are the things in the room. The inert stuff in the birth space is never just stuff. Beds, lights, stools, showers, bathtubs. These things shape what is possible in the room. But objects can be moved and spaces reshaped. Lights can be dimmed, clocks can be covered up, and hospital beds can be wheeled into the corridor. There are always institutions present. Bureaucracies, laws, policies, regulations are unavoidable, and they tend to focus on fixed parameters and strict hierarchies that aren't always helpful for an individual woman's labour. But institutions are also made up of intelligent, creative, and empathetic human beings, many of whom care deeply about the women they are caring for. There are also technologies that can save lives, but sometimes also make labour more difficult. There might be a CTG machine in the corner for monitoring the baby's heart rate. The machine can inform and reassure at the same time as it prompts anxiety or becomes a tool for abuse. If it's used well, a CTG can be an ally. Used badly, it can cause harm, and this goes for all the tools and technologies that carers might use. Time is always important, especially when things happen too slowly or too late. Time might seem like a neutral way to mark an unfolding event, but it's not. Clock time lends itself to a standardised measurement of progress, but labour time is a different thing. It follows the cadence of the body's contractions. Many stories highlighted the way that time can be on our side, especially if the anxieties of the ticking clock are held at bay and there's space given for labour to unfold safely in its own time. Finally, there is love. Love is not always the dominant emotion in the birth space, although it could be and should be. Oxytocin is a hormone crucial to labour, and it is also the chemical imprint of love and of feelings of safety, trust, empathy, and connection. In other words, there can be no labour without love. If a life begins in birth, so too do our human relationships. Seeking to begin these in love ought to be simple common sense. Bodies, things, institutions, technologies, time, love, and a baby. These are some of our companions in birth. And like companions in life, they don't always work peacefully together. But these companions are always doing work in the birth space. They are there collectively shaping the experience. How do we gather this collective in a productive way? How do we compile a team that will shape positive and empowering birth experiences for all kinds of different women? A starting point is to put love at the centre and to start taking collective responsibility for making sure it stays there. So welcome back everybody to the live chat. So while you absorb the film, I thought I might talk a little bit about one of the examples that comes through in the book. So each of those 8 companions of childbirth that I talk about in the film is the focus of one of the chapters. And what I do is kind of pick one of the things that was really prominent in the stories that we heard from the people that we interviewed, and I track the role of that thing in the birth space. So I talk about the baby and the way that the baby has agency and the way that complicates a mother's body, makes her not one body but more than that. I talk about the bed and the history of the bed in the birth. A lot of women shared stories about birthing on beds and the way there's a kind of bed in the corner that calls you to lie down on it. But lying down on a bed is not always the best thing to be doing. And in the chapter on institutions, I talk about the role of bureaucracy in governing the birth experience. And I also have a chapter that talks about loving technologies, where I focus particularly on the cardiotocogram, the CTG machine, that is commonly used in most hospitals on a routine basis in the contemporary world. Now, it's one of the more contentious areas of debate in the birth wars is the role of technology in childbirth. There's a lot of concerns about what those technologies do and what they, in terms of a perspective that's really interested in supporting women through natural birth, there's a real concern about what those technologies stop from a woman from doing. So one of the really key critiques of a CTG machine is made by the anthropologist Robbie Davis Floyd, who talks about how it kind of separates a woman from being in her body in the experience of childbirth and actually knowing herself what is going on. And that experience was certainly echoed in some of the interviews that we did. But at the same time, there are other ways of relating to machines. And there are ways that machines and that technology can be called in to relations that offer a woman a space of loving support through her birth experience, which is recognized across the board as being a really, really important thing for a positive experience and for a good birth. So in the chapter in the book, for example, I talk about the history of this CTG machine, the way that it entered the birthing room, and the way that it became something that was used routinely rather than just being used from time to time when it was needed. One of the things that's really interesting about the CTG is that I found that a lot of the medical staff that spoke about it talked about having to use it. You had to use it in order to get a trace of what was going on. You had to hook people up. There was one wonderful quote where a woman said, it's there in the corner. And you know, first thing you do when a woman comes in is you whack her on the bed and whack the CTG on. And she recognized that habit's not necessarily great or responsive to what a woman might need. There's a lot of controversy over whether the kind of monitoring that it's done is really a helpful thing or not. So there was enormous enthusiasm for the potential of this technology when it came in, as being a way to improve safety for mothers and for babies, and to provide a vision into the black box, I quote, of childbirth and pregnancy. And the trace that it gives is now a really important record of what has gone on. And there's a lot of discussion about how that record is an important legal document, so that the insistence on using the CTG may, in some circumstances, be motivated more by an interest in creating a legal document than on what's useful or helpful for a woman. So there were stories of people experiencing the use of that machine in really negative ways, being made to lie down on the bed and strapped to it, even though they really wanted to be up and moving around. There were also stories of women who found the readout from the machine really reassuring and helpful in terms of feeling reassured that what was going on was a positive thing. So there's a lot of conflict and a lot of discussion about that, and a lot of different stories about how you can relate to the machine in the corner of the room. And I wanted to talk about the way that there's potential here to enroll the machine in a practice of loving care. So one of the problems with the CTG trace as a legal record is that it's kind of seen as an authoritative account of what was going on. There's a lot of problems with assuming that, because interpretation is everything, and understanding what the heart rates mean is also quite contentious. There's only ever been one study that I found that has been the basis for the parameters of what's acceptable in an infant heart rate in terms of its acceleration or deceleration. That study was conducted in 1893, and the findings of that study in terms of of the parameters of heart rates remains in place, because no one's ever repeated the study, because you can't repeat that study. To do that would place infants at risk potentially. So we put a lot of store in the machine in some interesting ways. But I also had some wonderful stories about the way that people can interact with and negotiate with that machine, with a sense of love and care for the woman and the baby and what she wants. And I argue in the book that there's a chance to have a relationship with all of these things in the room, including the machine, in a way that's helpful. So there are a couple of questions coming into the chat, so I might stop ranting on about CTGs and respond. So one from Ronnie: it's so hard to imagine anyone pushing the hospital bed into the corridor. The vision of it is magnificent. Yeah, and that was a really lovely story that came through in one of the interviews. This idea that because the bed, you know, you see a bed and you think, I should lie on that bed, so you go and lie on the bed. And because all the images that you see on TV and in movies of women giving birth, they're always lying down on beds. So there was a chance to change the space and to do things differently. From Cassandra Smith: it's difficult to find people and things that will help you feel special and important. Finding the low risk label feels more like she'll be right than what do you need. So that seems, I think, to be a comment about risk. I'm not sure, Cassandra, I might need you to expand on what that question is. What will help you feel special and important? I guess one of the messages that I want to get across from this work, I was asked, I had a midwife in an audience once who said, okay, well, what's the best practice then that you see coming out of this? What is the code? What is the model that you might then apply to maternity care based on this kind of understanding of what might be going on? And really, I'm not in any position to be advocating for a model of care as such, but I think what I am advocating for is an awareness that for mothers in particular, for people who are expecting babies, and for those who are caring for mothers, to be really aware that the responsibility for that birth experience is a shared responsibility, and it's something that's spread across the collective that gathers in the space. Sometimes the things that are in the room are things that can be easily negotiated. You can cover up a clock really easily, and then the way that you interact with time can change as the woman in the room at any rate. Other things are more difficult. So if you're encountering situations, which women have, where you've got different medical professionals in the same space who are disagreeing about what ought to happen, it's a much more difficult experience. But to know that there is negotiation that needs to be underway, and to have a sense for how to do that, to do it guided by a concern for a warm and loving space in which to bring a child into the world. That, I think, is the main point that comes out. Things embody stories. Yes, things do embody stories. That's one of the ideas that I really enjoyed exploring in this book. Actually, I got to go and read the history of things that I didn't know about. So the chapter on the bed was really fun to work on, because I started to think about, well, when did women first start giving birth on beds? And there's this wonderful legend that it was the fault of Louis XIV, whose mistress was in labor, and he wanted to see it. So he hid behind a curtain and made the physician get her up on a bed so that he would have a better view. Now, whether or not that story is true is beside the point, really. But it's the same dynamic now, actually, when we were talking to medical professionals about that birthing space and what's good for a woman, and what's good for an attending carer. We had one obstetrician who was quite forthright in his views, and was really really clear. What the best birth space is one that's really brightly lit, and you've got the right kind of bed, you know, the woman's legs are up and you've got a really good clear view of what's going on. That's for the woman really a not nice birth experience. And I know, because that was the experience I had with my first baby. You don't feel comfortable, you feel very exposed, and it might be very convenient for the doctor to not have to get down on his hands and knees. And that's actually what he said. He said, he says, I hate it when a woman's on the floor, you know, then I just get the midwives to go down there. So there were some really interesting and quite confronting stories as well. Lily was thinking of the capacity of things to hold emotion and stories in the birthing room. Yeah, so I was really interested in asking people about special things that they brought into the space with them, things that they focused on to help them through the experience and deal with the pain. And I was especially interested in the way that spaces anywhere could become spaces that were gentle and held a woman and made her feel safe and good. And it kind of, in the end, it became clear that it didn't really matter if that space was at home in a home birth, or if that space was in an operating theatre for an elective cesarean. There were always ways to create a space that felt loving and caring and protective. So yeah, even when there were stories told of women having to go in for a very frightening emergency cesarean, simple things of the gentle way in which a woman could be treated were really important. And conversely, stories where that failed to happen, and where things that that were quite incidental were quite upsetting for women as well. So yeah, I'm very grateful to all the people that shared their stories for this book. It was a real privilege to hear so many very intimate stories. If nothing else, it's really clear that the experience of childbirth is a very deep experience with long-lasting effects that I think we don't give enough credence to. Women recalling their experiences of childbirth decades after the event still felt it very deeply. So yeah, it was a really important thing. So Af, I missed your question. What would you add to those midwives pamphlets to help all the agents work together? That's a really good question. I think it's difficult because public health relies upon authoritative messages being given by medical experts to the public. And that dynamic, as we know from the experience of COVID, is really important. It's really important that there are authoritative messages and people pay attention to them. Childbirth, of course, is not an illness. And there is a sense that in childbirth, a woman being really well connected with what's happening in her own body can be really, really helpful. So those pamphlets need to maybe step outside of that really classic public health messaging kind of mode, and be acknowledging that in this experience of maternity and childbirth, there are many different ways of doing it, many different ways of feeling it and enacting it. And that while there are certainly boundaries that cross into things being unsafe and action needed to be taken urgently, there's a lot of space in there for things to be done in different ways, and different ideas, different values to be acknowledged and respected. Kerry, I was wondering if you could say more about objects making decisions. It makes sense to me that they facilitate and allow particular actions or interactions. Yeah. It's a fascinating point, I think. So, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Bennett is that she offers, at the beginning of her book, an idea of very much of the agency of objects doing things. And I can remember that experience of reading it, and still by the end kind of not really feeling particularly convinced that they do stuff. And when I was writing this book, I was really playing with that idea of what objects do. And I think it's got to do with what Lily was pointing out. The objects hold the stories, they hold their purpose and intent, and make stuff happen in particular ways. So the presence of a bed makes things happen in particular ways. The object itself carries all of that history and that significance in its making and in the way we interact with it. Remove the object and a different set of possibilities emerge. And things hold different stories for different people too. That's a really, that's a good comment, Af. And there's some nice examples of that in the interviews as well, just to keep, I could keep harping on about all of them. Actually, they were running through my mind. So the CTG means different things to different people. And the bed means different things to different people. So, you know, some beds were places of comfort and support, and some beds were places of torture, really, for women. And it was, the meaning then became fixed to those objects. And it was about how we related to one another, which is, I think when you think about agency is never something that happens on its own. Agency is something that happens in relation to other things. So whether that in relationness is about human beings relating to one another, or it's about how objects and human beings relate to one another, is really interesting. And that idea of things having agency is something, you know, what's not in the book at all is an Indigenous perspective on birth. And the more that I learn in recent years and months about that, gives another whole angle to that sense of agency. So that you have, I just heard a story the other day about the relationship between the mountain and the rain and the tree and the woman and the baby, so that the baby is born after the mother has drunk the water that's flowed off the mountain and into the stream, and eaten the meat from the kangaroo that's been living in the bush. And so the spirit of all those things, of the mountain and the water and the kangaroo and the tree that was providing the shelter, enter into the mother's body through that, and therefore into the child's body. And the child is born already with the spirit of all those things in her. And that's partly why when you come to that, you come to this understanding that country is your family, because it's in you and you share that spirit. Barbara, thanks. Did you hear anything about how objects that women bring into the birthing room and how they worked? Yeah, I asked women about what they brought in, and what I was looking for in a way were things like the stories that you have of the Jizo statues, which are sort of they give you protection during childbirth, or there are ancient Babylonian tablets with incantations that were to protect a woman through the childbirth experience. And I wondered if there were modern equivalences for, you know, for upper middle class mums in Sydney, which I spoke to a lot of people from that demographic. And often people said, well, I had all this stuff and I brought it in and I stacked it up. And then it all just became completely irrelevant. So very few people named the things that they brought into the room. But there were a few people, and I connected to this because this was me as well, who focused, because when there were a lot of women that talked about going into Labourland, this kind of retreat from your normal state of consciousness into a slightly different state, an alternative sense of consciousness. And to assist in that process, they found themselves focusing on one spot on the wall. So one not in the wood, or for myself, it was focusing on the white flowers on the bush outside the window of where I was in labour. I should have turned off my phone, shouldn't I? Thanks, Marco. So we've been going now for 50 minutes, and I'm sure everyone's feeling exhausted and probably wants to start on the canapes and the bubbly, since this is my virtual book launch after all. Does anyone else have any ideas or any comments they'd like to share? I'd love to hear any feedback. If not, maybe I'll just draw it to a close then and say thank you to everyone for coming along and listening. But most importantly, thank you as well to everyone who's contributed to this book along the way. There are a lot of people, and I hope some of you are here now, and I hope that some of you are able to see this as the recording later on. As a 10-year project, there's a lot of people to thank. I've already mentioned the universities that have all lent their support to allow me to do this project in my slow way. And I've thanked all the people who interviewed, and then there were the wonderful readers who read and gave feedback. And also the people I haven't thanked, which are my family, and most particularly my wonderful 3 children who taught me the bulk of what I know in an embodied way about childbirth. So thank you everyone for coming along.
Thank you very much, Katharine, for spending the time with us tonight to give us that really wonderful talk. I must say I like the sound of the birth with the mountain and the stream and the bush and the kangaroo. Certainly made me think about things a little bit differently. We wish you every success with your book, and I'm sure it's better for the years and the thought that went into it, and we wish you every success. So thank you for coming along tonight, and thank you to everyone who joined us as well. We might finish there.